A young black boy boards his first solo flight, only to face an unjust confrontation with a flight attendant who doubts he belongs in first class. As tensions rise and the situation spirals out of control, the boy's true connection to the airline shocks everyone. How will this life-altering encounter unfold? Subscribe to the channel and follow to see how this story unfolds. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Alex Carter adjusted the straps of his sleek blue backpack as he stood in line at the boarding gate. His father had picked it out for him last Christmas, saying it was perfect for the adventures of a young scholar. Alex loved it not because of its numerous compartments or even its waterproof exterior, but because it made him feel grown up. This was no ordinary trip for Alex, it was his first solo flight. The airport was a whirlwind of movement, filled with the hum of announcements and the click-clack of hurried footsteps. Travelers darted around Alex like waves breaking against a rock, but the boy stood steady, clutching his boarding pass in one hand and a dog-eared copy of Hidden Figures in the other. The book had been his constant companion for weeks, and he had read it so many times that he could recite entire passages. Behind him, a woman with a floral suitcase nudged her companion and whispered something while nodding toward Alex. He caught the glance out of the corner of his eye and turned slightly. They quickly looked away. Alex had seen those kinds of stares before, the subtle yet weighty ones that seemed to ask, "What's he doing here?" Alex wasn't like most kids his age. His confidence was understated but palpable, a result of being raised by a man who believed in teaching self-respect early. His father, Evan Carter, was a towering figure in Alex's life, not just because of his height, but because of his accomplishments. Evan had built a successful tech company from scratch, eventually diversifying into industries that included aviation. But to Alex, his dad wasn't the entrepreneur on magazine covers, he was just Dad, the man who took him fishing, helped him build model airplanes, and insisted they read at least one biography of a black trailblazer every month. "Okay, buddy," Evan had said that morning as they stood by the security checkpoint. "You've got this. Show them that Carters handle everything with grace." He adjusted Alex's collar, his smile warm yet laced with the tension of letting his son take this big step alone. Alex had nodded with a grin. "I'll text you when I land, Dad. Grace and all." Now, as Alex reached the front of the boarding line, a cheerful gate agent scanned his ticket. Her smile didn't falter, but there was a pause as her eyes flicked to the premium cabin number on the boarding pass. "First class," she said, more to herself than to Alex, before handing the ticket back. "Enjoy your flight, young man." "Thank you," Alex replied, his voice steady. He walked down the jet bridge, doing his best to mimic the calm confidence his father exuded. This was no time to falter. As he entered the plane, Alex was greeted by Sarah Johnson, a white flight attendant in her late 30s. Her neatly pressed uniform and perfectly pinned hair gave her an air of professionalism, but her eyes scanned Alex with a flicker of something else, a question she didn't vocalize. "Welcome aboard," Sarah said, her tone polite but lacking warmth. "Can I help you find your seat?" "I'm in 2A," Alex replied, holding up his boarding pass. Sarah blinked. "Oh, okay, right this way." Alex moved past her, sliding into the plush first-class seat. He placed his backpack under the seat in front of him and pulled out Hidden Figures. The cabin buzzed with activity as other passengers stowed their luggage and settled in. Yet Alex couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were lingering on him longer than necessary. Sarah reappeared a few moments later, ostensibly to offer Alex a drink. She bent down slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Excuse me, but are your parents in the back of the plane?" Alex's brow furrowed. "No, I'm traveling alone." She hesitated, glancing around as if seeking confirmation from someone else. "Are you sure this is your seat?" "Yes, Mom," Alex replied, holding up his boarding pass again. He felt his stomach tighten but forced himself to remain calm. "My dad booked it for me." Sarah straightened and nodded, but her lips pressed into a thin line. "All right, let me know if you need anything." As she walked away, Alex noticed her stop by another flight attendant and whisper something. They both turned their heads briefly in his direction before quickly returning to their tasks. Alex tried to brush it off, burying himself in his book, but the exchange lingered in his mind. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair gave Alex a strained smile before leaning over to his wife. "Well, that's different," Alex overheard him say. The woman shushed him, but her own gaze lingered on Alex for a moment too long. The first announcement came over the intercom, instructing passengers to fasten their seatbelts and prepare for takeoff. Alex followed the instructions diligently, even checking his seatbelt twice. He was determined to show that he belonged here, regardless of what anyone else thought. As the plane began to taxi, Alex couldn't help but recall one of his father's favorite sayings: "People will always have opinions, son. Just make sure you're confident in your own." Alex smiled faintly at the memory, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of his book. But as the plane took off, he couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was going to be anything but ordinary. The flight was smooth, and Alex was beginning to relax. He had settled into the luxurious comfort of his first-class seat, the soft hum of the engines and the occasional clinking of glasses adding to the atmosphere. He flipped through the pages of Hidden Figures, completely engrossed in the story of Katherine Johnson's mathematical brilliance. For a while, he managed to forget about the curious looks and whispers from earlier. Then Sarah returned. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her tone firmer now. Her shadow loomed over Alex as he looked up from his book. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" Alex blinked in surprise but nodded. He reached into the seat pocket, where he had tucked the slip of paper, and handed it to her. Sarah examined the boarding pass as if searching for a hidden clue. Her brow furrowed, and she glanced at Alex with a hint of skepticism. "This says 2A," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "And it's valid, I see." Alex tilted his head, unsure how to respond. "Is there a problem?" Sarah hesitated, her lips pursed. "I just wanted to confirm. You're alone on this flight?" "Yes, Ma, I am," Alex said, doing his best to remain polite despite the growing knot in his stomach. He thought of his father's advice about grace, repeating the words in his mind to steady himself. Sarah nodded stiffly and handed the boarding pass back to him. "All right, thank you." She turned and walked away, but not toward the galley. Instead, Alex noticed her heading toward the back of the plane, where the head purser stood talking to a junior flight attendant. The knot in Alex's stomach tightened further as he saw Sarah gesturing discreetly toward the first-class cabin, whispering to her colleagues. Minutes later, Sarah returned, but this time she wasn't alone. The head purser, a man named Greg who looked like he had seen it all, accompanied her. His face was calm but unreadable, his professional smile in place as he approached Alex's seat. "Good afternoon," Sir Greg said, crouching slightly to be at eye level with Alex. "Can we have a quick word?" Alex glanced around nervously. Other passengers were now fully engaged, pretending not to look but failing miserably. He set his book down slowly, feeling their stares like a spotlight. "Is something wrong?" Alex asked. Greg's smile faltered slightly, though he kept his tone pleasant. "We just need to verify a few details. Could you please step into the galley with us?" Alex hesitated, his pulse quickening. "Why? Did I do something wrong?" No, Greg assured him quickly. "It's just a routine check." Reluctantly, Alex unclasped his seatbelt and followed the two attendants toward the small galley area behind the first-class cabin. The whispers of passengers trailed him like a wave. Once inside, Sarah crossed her arms, her earlier politeness replaced by a sharp edge. "Look," she said, her voice quieter but no less pointed, "we need to be sure. It's not every day we see an unaccompanied minor in first class." Greg shot her a warning glance but didn't interrupt. Alex stood straighter, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "My dad booked this ticket. I have every right to be here." Greg cleared his throat. "Of course you do, and we're not trying to imply otherwise. It's just that sometimes there are misunderstandings. We want to ensure everything is in order." Alex frowned, his confidence wavering. "I showed you my boarding pass. What else do you need?" Sarah's face tightened, and she opened her mouth as if to say something, but Greg interrupted. "We've just contacted the gate staff to confirm your details. It's standard procedure for unaccompanied minors. If everything checks out, you'll be back in your seat in no time." Alex nodded slowly, his unease growing. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, each moment dragging like hours. The galley felt smaller by the second, and the muffled murmurs of passengers in the cabin seemed louder than ever. As Alex waited, he thought about his dad. Evan had always been meticulous about ensuring every detail was perfect for Alex's travels. His dad wouldn't have overlooked something as important as confirming a first-class ticket. He swallowed hard and took a deep breath. This will all be fine, he told himself. But as he glanced at Sarah's skeptical expression and the way Greg avoided meeting his eyes directly, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. Back in the cabin, phones were already out, the unmistakable glow of recording screens reflecting off the windows. Passengers whispered, speculating on the scene unfolding behind the curtain. A middle-aged woman in pearls leaned toward her husband, whispering loud enough for anyone to hear, "I told you something wasn't right. He doesn't look like he belongs in first class." At that moment, Alex didn't know which hurt more, the blatant suspicion or the fact that no one seemed to stand up for him. Alex stood in the cramped galley, his heart pounding as Greg checked his watch nervously. The moments felt like hours, and the low hum of the airplane engines did little to drown out the murmurs beyond the thin curtain separating the galley from the cabin. Alex clenched his fists at his sides, his father's advice about Grace battling the rising frustration in his chest. This wasn't right, and he knew it. "Listen, young man," Sarah began, her tone attempting to sound patient but dripping with condescension. "We're just doing our jobs. If everything checks out, we'll get you back to your seat, no problem." "I already showed you my boarding pass," Alex replied firmly, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "What else do you need?" Greg stepped in, his expression a mix of professionalism and discomfort. "Alex, right? Sometimes with unaccompanied minors there's confusion about ticketing. We're just waiting to hear back from the gate agents to confirm everything." Alex's jaw tightened. "Confusion? I told you my dad booked my ticket. Why is that so hard to believe?" Greg hesitated, glancing at Sarah. She avoided his gaze and busied herself with straightening a napkin on the galley counter. It was clear that this situation had spiraled beyond what either of them had anticipated, but neither seemed willing to admit it outright. Just then, the intercom crackled, and a voice came through. "Greg, we have a message from the gate about the unaccompanied minor. Could you please come up front?" Greg nodded quickly, his relief palpable. "Stay here, Alex. I'll be right back." As Greg slipped through the curtain, Alex was left alone with Sarah. Her once polished demeanor now seemed defensive, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The tension between them was thick, and Alex decided to break the silence. "You don't believe I belong in first class, do you?" he asked, his tone direct but calm. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by his bluntness. "That's not what this is about," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "We just need to make sure everything checks out." "Everything already did," Alex shot back. "You're the only one making this complicated." Sarah opened her mouth to respond but stopped as the curtain rustled. Greg returned, his face unreadable. For a brief moment, Alex thought he might finally be able to return to his seat and put this behind him. But Greg's hesitant posture suggested otherwise. "Well," Sarah asked, her voice tinged with impatience. Greg sighed, avoiding Alex's gaze. "The gate confirmed his ticket," he said quietly. "It's legitimate." Alex exhaled in relief, but Sarah didn't look convinced. "Then why all the confusion?" she pressed. Greg hesitated. "There wasn't any. His father's account booked the ticket. It's all perfectly in order." Alex's shoulders squared. "Can I go back to my seat now?" Greg nodded. "Yes, of course. Let me escort you." But before Alex could move, Sarah stepped in. "Wait a minute," she said, her tone sharper now. "We need to think about the safety of all passengers. Are we absolutely sure?" "That's enough," Greg cut her off, his voice low but firm. "Everything is in order. Let it go." Sarah bristled, her mouth tightening as if she wanted to argue but knew she couldn't. She stepped aside and Alex walked past her, his head held high. He could feel her eyes on him as Greg guided him back to his seat, but he didn't look back. When Alex returned to his seat, the whispers from the other passengers grew louder. Eyes followed him as if he were walking a red carpet, their curiosity thinly veiled by half-hearted smiles and upward nods. A man in a tailored suit leaned toward his companion and muttered something Alex couldn't hear, but the smirk on the man's face told him all he needed to know. Sliding into 2A, Alex noticed that his book was no longer on his seat. He searched the floor and the surrounding area, frowning. Just as he was about to ask a flight attendant for help, the older man across the aisle held up Hidden Figures with a sheepish grin. "Sorry, kid," the man said. "Just wanted to check out what you were reading." Alex forced a polite smile as he took the book back. He turned away quickly, hoping the man wouldn't say more, but of course he did. "Great book," the man added. "Pretty advanced for someone your age, huh?" Alex said nothing, focusing on opening the book to the last page he'd read. His fingers gripped the edges tightly, the paper crinkling under his touch. Moments later, Greg reappeared at Alex's side. "Everything all right here, Alex?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. "Yes," Alex said curtly, keeping his eyes on his book. Greg hesitated. "Look, I just wanted to say, if there's anything you need, just let me know, okay?" Alex nodded without looking up, and Greg left. As the minutes ticked by, the murmurs in the cabin began to die down, but Alex's mind was still racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that no one, not even Greg, had truly been on his side. They had gone through the motions, but only because they'd been forced to. He thought of his dad. Evan would never have let this happen. If he'd been on this flight, none of them would have dared question Alex's place in first class. But Evan wasn't here, and Alex had to deal with the fallout alone. Meanwhile, at the back of the plane, Sarah stood in the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Greg approached her cautiously. "This isn't worth losing your job over, Sarah," he said quietly. "Let it go." She turned to him, her expression a mix of indignation and uncertainty. "I was just trying to." "To what? Protect the airline? Do you even hear yourself?" Sarah's jaw clenched. "I don't like being made to feel like the bad guy." Greg sighed. "Then stop acting like one. The kid's just a passenger like anyone else. Treat him that way." Sarah said nothing, but her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned back to the counter, staring at her reflection in the shiny surface of the coffee pot. In the first-class cabin, Alex stared out the window, his book forgotten on his lap. He watched the clouds drift by, trying to push the humiliation and anger to the back of his mind. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop wondering, why did they assume I didn't belong here? What did I do wrong? He didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. Not yet. The flight had settled into an uneasy quiet, but the tension in the air was still palpable. Alex sat in his seat, his gaze fixed on the window as the sun cast golden streaks across the clouds. On the surface, everything seemed calm, but he couldn't shake the memory of the confrontation in the galley. Each glance from a fellow passenger felt like a spotlight, and their whispers, though faint, sounded deafening in his ears. Alex clutched his book tightly, but the words on the page blurred together. He wasn't reading anymore, he was reliving the earlier moment over and over. He wondered what his dad would do if he were here. Would he have confronted Sarah? Would he have demanded to speak to the captain? Alex imagined his father's calm but firm voice cutting through the awkward excuses, but he knew he didn't have that same authority. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hi, sweetie." Alex turned to see a flight attendant kneeling by his seat. It wasn't Sarah. This woman, whose name tag read Linda, looked older, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Are you doing okay?" she asked gently, her voice a stark contrast to the clipped tone Sarah had used. Alex nodded stiffly. "I'm fine." Linda hesitated, glancing at the empty glass on his tray table. "Can I get you something to drink? Maybe a snack?" Alex shook his head. "No, thank you." Linda lingered for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "If you need anything, just press the call button." "Okay." Alex nodded again, and Linda gave him a reassuring smile before walking away. Her kindness was a small comfort, but it didn't erase the humiliation he had felt, or the glances he still caught from across the cabin. A few rows back, Greg sat in the jump seat, staring at the cabin monitor and tapping his pen against his clipboard. He hadn't seen Sarah since their terse conversation in the galley, and he was starting to regret not stepping in sooner. He had known from the beginning that her suspicions were unfounded, but he hadn't wanted to escalate things. Now, as he watched Alex huddle in his seat, he realized his inaction had only made things worse. He flipped to a blank page in his clipboard and began jotting down notes, making sure to document everything. He wasn't sure how this would play out once they landed, but he wanted to be prepared. Back in the cabin, Alex's focus shifted as he noticed the man across the aisle staring at him again. This time, the man didn't bother pretending he wasn't looking. Instead, he leaned over and spoke in a low voice. "Hey kid," the man said, his tone casual but intrusive. "Can I ask you something?" Alex stiffened but turned slightly to acknowledge him. "Where are your parents? Are they waiting for you at the airport?" Alex hesitated. He wasn't sure if the man was genuinely curious or if this was just another veiled attempt to question his place in first class. "They'll meet me when I land," Alex said simply, keeping his answer vague. The man nodded, but his expression was skeptical. "Must be nice to fly up here. Most kids your age don't get this kind of luxury." Alex didn't respond, choosing instead to bury his nose in his book again. The man's words hung in the air, a reminder that even among strangers, assumptions about him were impossible to escape. Meanwhile, Sarah stood at the back of the plane, sipping a cup of water and trying to collect her thoughts. She knew Greg was right, this wasn't worth her job, but the nagging voice in her head wouldn't let her drop it. She had convinced herself that she had acted out of caution, not prejudice, but deep down, she wasn't so sure. The discomfort she felt was more than just professional embarrassment, it was the beginning of self-doubt. As Sarah turned back toward the cabin, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out discreetly and saw a notification from the airline's internal app. A passenger complaint had already been filed, a concern about a child being harassed in first class. Her stomach dropped. She could guess who had submitted it, and she knew the repercussions could be serious. Sarah exhaled deeply, her thoughts swirling. The rest of the flight stretched before her like a tightrope, and she wasn't sure she could make it to the other side without falling. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Alex finally managed to focus on his book again, though he couldn't ignore the occasional whisper or glance from the passengers around him. He reminded himself of his father's words, "Grace under pressure, Alex. Always." But as much as he tried to embrace that advice, a small voice inside him whispered something else: "This isn't fair." Alex didn't know it yet, but his quiet resistance and calm resolve were setting the stage for a confrontation far bigger than anything he could have imagined. The plane had barely touched down when Alex heard the buzz of notifications on his tablet. He opened it to find his inbox flooded with messages, some from his dad and others from friends. Confused, he clicked on one of the links his best friend had sent. It was a video. Alex's heart sank as he watched a shaky, zoomed-in clip of himself being escorted to the galley earlier during the flight. The caption read, "Boy questioned in first class. Why?" Hundreds of comments had already poured in, ranging from sympathetic to blatantly racist. Alex's face burned as he realized the moment had gone viral. "Sir, please remain seated until we arrive at the gate," a flight attendant said, jolting Alex from his thoughts. The rest of the passengers had noticed the video too. Their sidelong glances were no longer curious, they were now tinged with recognition. Some whispered, while others openly recorded Alex on their phones. It felt like the walls of the cabin were closing in on him. When the plane finally docked, Alex was among the last to leave. He waited for the aisle to clear, gripping his backpack tightly as if it were a shield. As he stepped into the jet bridge, he spotted Greg, the head purser, waiting for him with a concerned look. "Alex," Greg said gently, stepping aside to let other passengers pass. "Can you wait here for a moment? Someone's here to meet you." Alex frowned. "My dad." Greg nodded but didn't say more. The two stood in silence until Evan Carter strode into view, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was impeccably dressed, his tailored navy suit contrasting sharply with the wrinkled travel attire of the other passengers. "Dad," Alex exclaimed, rushing toward him. Evan knelt to give his son a quick, reassuring hug before straightening to face Greg. His expression was calm, but his tone carried the weight of someone accustomed to being in control. "Are you the one I need to speak to about what happened on this flight?" Greg hesitated. I was involved, but it might be better if we all sit down to discuss." "Who else was involved?" Evan interrupted, his voice sharper now. "I want names." Greg glanced nervously over his shoulder. The flight attendant in question is still on board, handling post-flight duties. I can. Bring her here, Evan said. It wasn't a request. Greg nodded and hurried back into the plane, leaving Alex and his father alone. Evan placed a hand on Alex's shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. Are you all right, son? Evan asked. Alex hesitated before nodding. Yeah, I'm okay. It was just weird. They didn't believe I belonged in first class. Evan's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. Don't worry. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. Moments later, Greg returned with Sarah in tow. She looked visibly flustered, her earlier confidence replaced by a mix of apprehension and defensiveness. She barely met Evan's gaze as she stepped forward. Mr. Carter, Greg began. This is Sarah Johnson, the flight attendant who... Evan raised a hand, cutting him off. He turned his full attention to Sarah, his piercing gaze unwavering. Ms. Johnson, I understand there was some confusion about my son's seat during the flight. Would you care to explain? Sarah's mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally, she managed, I was just following protocol, sir. We have procedures for unaccompanied minors and... Protocol, Evan repeated, his voice measured. Does protocol include publicly humiliating a child who was clearly seated where he was supposed to be? Sarah's face turned red. No, sir. I didn't mean for it to escalate like that. But it did, Evan said firmly. And now my son is the subject of a viral video because of your actions. Sarah flinched, but Evan wasn't done. Let me make something clear. My son belongs wherever he chooses to be, whether it's first class or anywhere else. Your assumptions about him are unacceptable. Greg shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could disappear. Sarah looked like she wanted to say something but thought better of it. Evan straightened, his voice commanding as he addressed both of them. This is not just about an apology. It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through what my son experienced today. I expect a full report to your supervisors, and trust me, I will be following up. He turned to Alex, his expression softening. Come on, son, let's go. As they walked away, Alex glanced up at his dad. Are they going to lose their jobs? That's not for me to decide, Evan said. But they'll have to answer for what they did. Alex nodded, feeling a sense of relief for the first time since boarding the plane. For now, at least he knew his dad had his back. Evan Carter guided Alex through the bustling terminal, his hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. The father's calm but purposeful stride drew attention, not just because of his commanding presence but also due to the viral video now spreading like wildfire. Travelers whispered as they recognized the boy from the clip, their glances a mixture of curiosity and guilt for having silently watched the injustice unfold. As they approached the airline's VIP lounge, a sharply dressed woman with a clipboard intercepted them. Her face was tight with a mix of anxiety and determination. Mr. Carter, she said, offering a quick, polite nod. I'm Samantha Hayes, the regional director for this airline. We just received word of the incident, and I'd like to extend our deepest apologies. Evan paused, his gaze sharp but measured. Ms. Hayes, I trust you've already been briefed on what happened. Yes, sir, Samantha said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. I assure you we take this matter very seriously. We're prepared to conduct a full investigation and take the necessary actions to address the behavior of our staff. An investigation, Evan asked, his tone cool. While I appreciate the sentiment, this is not simply a procedural issue. It's systemic. My son was humiliated because of assumptions your staff made about him based on nothing but his appearance. Samantha nodded, her lips pressing together in a thin line. You're absolutely right. This isn't just about one incident, it's about the culture that allowed it to happen. I'm committed to addressing it, starting immediately. Evan tilted his head slightly. And how do you intend to do that? Samantha took a deep breath. For starters, I'd like to arrange a formal meeting between you, Alex, and our senior leadership team to discuss actionable steps. We'll review our training protocols and ensure all staff undergo enhanced bias training. Additionally, I'd like to propose a public apology, acknowledging the harm caused. Evan regarded her for a moment before nodding. That's a start, but I'll be watching closely to make sure this doesn't become just another PR move. Samantha's expression remained resolute. "Understood, sir. We'll follow through." As Evan and Alex exited the lounge, they were met by a crowd of journalists waiting just beyond the secure area. Camera flashes and microphones jutted toward them like a wave, each reporter vying for a comment. "Mr. Carter, is it true you own a stake in the airline?" "Alex, how are you feeling after the incident? Will the flight attendant face disciplinary action?" Evan held up a hand, signaling for quiet. The crowd stilled as his voice rang out, steady and clear. "This is not just about my son," he began. "What happened today is part of a larger issue, a culture that allows implicit biases to shape how people are treated. This should serve as a wake-up call, not just for this airline but for all industries." He glanced at Alex, who stood a little taller under the camera's glare. "No child, no person should have to prove their worthiness because of how they look. We can and must do better." The crowd buzzed with murmurs as Evan led Alex away, the boy's hand gripping his father's tightly. The fallout from the incident rippled far beyond that one flight. Social media exploded with debates about systemic bias, personal accountability, and corporate responsibility. The airline, facing intense scrutiny, moved quickly to address the situation. At a press conference held in one of their hangars, Samantha Hayes stood at a podium flanked by executives. Behind her, a banner read "Commitment to Change Building Inclusive Skies." "The incident on Flight 732 was unacceptable," Samantha began, her voice firm but measured. "We failed to uphold our values, and for that we apologize. But an apology isn't enough. Today we are announcing a comprehensive plan to combat bias within our organization, starting with mandatory inclusivity training for all staff and a complete review of our protocols." The room buzzed with questions, but Samantha pressed on. "We are also launching a scholarship program in honor of Alex Carter, aimed at supporting young people from underrepresented communities who aspire to careers in aviation. We are grateful to Mr. Carter and Alex for bringing this issue to light." Evan and Alex sat together in their living room, watching the press conference unfold on TV. Alex wore a hesitant smile, his emotions a mixture of pride and lingering frustration. "Do you think it'll actually change anything?" Alex asked, his voice quiet. Evan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's a step in the right direction. Real change takes time, but what we did sparked something important." Alex looked down, running his fingers along the spine of his now worn copy of Hidden Figures. "I didn't really do anything." Evan turned to him, his expression earnest. "You stood up for yourself, Alex. You handled yourself with grace and dignity, even when it wasn't easy. That's more than most people manage." Alex's smile grew, more confident this time. "Maybe. But I'm glad we did something." Evan nodded. "Me too, son." A week later, Alex received an invitation in the mail. The airline had arranged a private tour of one of their hangars, and Alex was the guest of honor. At first, Alex wasn't sure he wanted to go. Reliving the incident felt uncomfortable. But his dad encouraged him, reminding him that this was an opportunity to see the positive changes firsthand. When they arrived at the hangar, they were greeted by Samantha Hayes, a few airline executives, and a small group of staff, including Greg. Sarah was notably absent, but Greg stepped forward, his demeanor humble. "Alex," he began, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how things unfolded that day. I should have stepped in sooner." Alex looked at him for a moment before nodding. "Thank you." Samantha guided them through the hangar, showing Alex everything from the cockpit of a plane to the maintenance bays. She even handed him a certificate naming him an honorary aviation ambassador, much to his delight. But the highlight of the day came when one of the airline's pilots approached Alex and handed him a small set of wings. "I hear you're a fan of airplanes," the pilot said with a smile. "We'd love to see you in the cockpit one day." Alex beamed, pinning the wings onto his shirt. "Maybe I will be." That night, as Alex lay in bed, he thought about everything that had happened. The stares, the whispers, the confrontation, it had all been so overwhelming. But now, as he traced his fingers over the small wings pinned to his shirt, he felt something he hadn't before: hope. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he would always carry this experience with him. And maybe, just maybe, it would inspire him to soar higher than he'd ever imagined.